Welcome to Stirring Strength, Perspectives on Mental Health and Addiction. I'm your host, Dean Anderson, and on today's show, we have Bronagh Morgan. Hi, Bronagh.
Hi, how are you?
I'm wonderful.
It's so great to be here, back in Roger's studio.
I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here. We got to meet a few years ago, and I didn't know it until you reminded me when we had a chat. You're like, hey, we met at that dinner. I was like, oh, yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, wonderful. You had reached out to me in regards to being on the show because you have a topic that's near and dear to your heart. Absolutely. And something that was meaningful. And there seems to be a bit of a theme going on right now in my life anyway. And on the show, we've had a couple people talking about grief, and I have a new friend that specializes in grief counseling, and other people have been talking, and it's just been this theme. You know how things happen, you kind of see it, and then you reached out and said, there's something more, and I said, wow, we got to talk about this. So would you mind sharing a little bit more about why it is that you want to be on the show?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind at all. So I think what prompted me to reach out to you recently was politics. So there was word that there was going to be a federal election. Now we know there is going to be. And also, we just had our provincial election. And it also is a Facebook memory that came up for me from something that happened 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, just before the whole world shut down, and we don't have to say why, but we all know why, I had a couple of meetings with the Associate Minister for Mental Health in Ontario, as well as the former president of LHSC, to move forward on something that has been close to my heart for many years, which is a strategy to demedicalize and kind of look at grief, like a bigger picture approach to grief support and care for people who are going through a bereavement. So whether that's you lose a child, you lose a partner, you lose a sibling, a parent, or any kind of a loss. So 2009, I became a part of an organization called Bereaved Families of Ontario because I had a little girl who died. She lived for 3 days. She had a genetic disease. And I had fantastic care in the hospital. No complaints. I had wonderful social workers, always had great conversations with the doctors. Can't say enough good about the nurses. And I got a pamphlet to go to get some support from bereaved families. I've never been through this, obviously, type of loss before. And it was unbelievable, the care that I got. And this is not mental health treatment. This is just being around people who have been through that same situation. And having the value of just being able to talk about things in that environment of people who understand, to me, I think was life-saving.
So these people were peers.
Yeah, a peer support organization.
Right? And then we'll put the name of the website on the screen.
And there are a lot of wonderful peer support organizations in Ontario and like across the country, around the world. And so when I got more involved with, doing volunteer work at the hospital, and the more I got involved in operations at bereaved families as well, finding out that a lot of people, if they don't have that kind of support, if they aren't able to access that great kind of peer support, grief can become complicated. You can end up with depression. It can be a pathway to substance abuse. And what we're looking at in our communities right now is we have like huge issues right now with, the rise in substance misuse. People end up being unhoused because of this, right? So a lot of different societal issues, and I'm like looking back, and a lot of this stuff can stem from a loss. That could be the catalyst for these things happening. So anyways, going back 5 years, I was fortunate enough to be able to make submissions at budget time every year because I knew some politicians, because I used to be a politician as well, talking about how we could kind of put together this larger grief strategy, which helps people who are going through this situation before they end up needing mental health care. So just like when that happens, if you have some understanding peers, your grief doesn't have to kind of spiral into something more complicated. You really just need a community of people around you that understand, because grief's not a mental illness, and it's going to happen to everybody in their life as well. So it benefits the individual, but it also benefits society, because we have this shortage, and everybody knows about this in the healthcare system. We have wait lists. I think I just read an article yesterday about how children and youth especially have such limited access to mental health care. We don't have enough mental health professionals to treat these people, and kids are waiting and waiting and waiting for years to access these kind of services. So we can pull people who don't need to be in the medical system into peer support programs and make this kind of a provincial strategy about this. So as opposed to an organization like Bereaved Families and other organizations which are fantastic about this, competing for the same funding dollars, asking for the same donations from the same pool of donors all of the time. If we had a provincial strategy to address this at the bedside in the hospital when somebody dies, in funeral homes, when the police have to go give you that terrible news. If we had a strategy that kind of encompassed all these organizations that are dealing with grieving people, we would be helping people, preventing them ending up in this system and then freeing up all those resources. And I had that agreement, but it was a handshake agreement. Not to say anything bad about a handshake agreement, but we all know what happened a couple of days later. The whole world shut down and none of these things got to move forward. And so looking at these Facebook memories coming up 5 years later and seeing where we are now with respect to, you know, the wait lists are longer. There are more people that are struggling with substance misuse. There are more people living on the streets now. Had we been able to implement that strategy 5 years ago, where would we be right now? And that we can't go back. We can't, you know, turn back time, but we can, now that it is election time again, talk about this. If people believe in the power of prevention, people believe in the power of doing something before people get to hit rock bottom, it's not only better for those people, but it's so much better for the system. It's so much cheaper. And we have the people, we have the expertise to do it. So why not now?
Yeah, so 100 million questions. We could like just go. So I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning.
Absolutely.
When you're talking about, you know, that this idea of grief being more of, and you use the word mental health, and I see that a lot of times where it's treated as though you have grief and therefore it's a mental health concern. But however, you know, my life, your life, everybody who's watching their life is impacted by grief. There's loss. It's inevitable. So it's actually part of the human experience. But you're saying that, you know, we're better off taking it out of the mental health and putting it into peer support, right?
Yeah, it's just a part of life. Like death is a part of life. And I think that that's a tough thing for people to kind of, you know, sit with. You're going to die. I'm going to die. Everybody loves.
Nobody gets out alive.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so, but there is so much, I think, that it's so hard for people to just sit with that reality. I think it makes us better as, you know, human beings to kind of contemplate our mortality all the time, right? You have a finite number of days. You have a finite number of minutes. So like do the best that you can with those moments that you have. But on top of that, seeing as how this is inevitable, why does it have to be so hard to talk about? And it shouldn't be. And it can be so isolating because it is so hard for people to talk about when somebody is going through. And, you know, a lot of people, when they think of somebody like me who has had child loss, like people think about that as like, just this is the absolute worst thing that you can go through in your life. And from my personal experience, I've had a lot of, you know, wonderful interactions. That's why I'm so spurred to try and make people's like have the same kind of experiences as I have. But at the same time, I know what it feels like to walk into that room and know people are like, oh my gosh, it's that lady. Oh, it's so sad. Like, it's just so depressing to be around her. Oh my gosh, when I open my mouth, it's just like too much for people to handle. So I know that feeling of isolation. And when you're already going through something so sad, and then adding that feeling of isolation on top of it, what's the solution? It's community.
I agree, and I'm going to keep chasing you, but I'm going to go back to right. I hear you say that it's still the medical thing, but and you're saying why is it? It's so normal, and we just talk about it, and we need community, we need these things. Why is it now that you think we progressed into the idea of the conversation being a medical or a mental health problem? Why are we there now?
Like, as opposed to, say, 50 years ago, I think, like, in particularly with respect to what happened to me, like losing a child, it was, you know, for my parents' generation even. So my parents were from Ireland, and they both had relatively large families. And so in most families, a child died, which is terrible. That's a terrible reality. But because it was such a part of people's lives, it was less of a kind of thing that we didn't talk about because it just happened. So wonderful things have happened that there is less child mortality now. But it has become this thing that it's almost like we don't think about it because we don't see it as much anymore. The same way that like women don't talk about like having pregnancy loss. It's almost like we don't tell people that we're pregnant for 3 months because we don't want, because there's the risk of this happening. And so if we don't talk about it, then it almost, it gives you that like isolation when it does happen to you. Right. So it's like we've progressed so much, so well, but this has kind of been like an unfortunate consequence of that.
So does that, so that separation and that silence, that anonymity, that personal side of things turns it into, instead of me getting help when I deal with this very human experience, that I feel like I need to go get medical help or I need to go see a professional because I can't talk to anybody else?
It could be. I think that's part of it. And I think sometimes like some people don't know that there are these other resources available to them, right? And because we're talking about these kind of things less, like I know the statistics about how many people have lost a child. I know the statistics of how many people have lost a pregnancy. But because we're so uncomfortable talking about these things, I don't know that the person next to me has gone through the same thing as me. Like I think maybe that's just a consequence of the way society is a little bit, you know, we've become more isolated from people, like despite the fact that we're more connected with our phones and the internet, we're less having these kind of interactions. And obviously COVID was like a great big isolating factor as well. I would love to say that we have gone back to the level of community closeness even that we had before that, but I don't know if we've all the way recovered as a society still. Like the damage, some damage is remained.
Yes. I think we continue to grow into a world that's more like the office space, where it's more water cooler talk and we don't get into bigger conversations, or we don't get into vulnerability, and we kind of walk past and smile and nod and let people see what we think they want to see. But then that would make that level of vulnerability terrifying.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
So, and then you said something which I recognize in my own world and in my own professional life, that there is an underlying piece to grief that leads into other things.
Absolutely.
So from your experience and your knowledge, how does that transition? Someone says, oh, there's people with addiction. It's like, well, what does that have to do with it? So from your opinion, how does that transition, that unresolved grief, how does it turn into these things?
Well, I think so the science behind it is like most grief is uncomplicated, right? It's just you integrate that loss into your personality and the way that you deal with the world after that. But in some cases, and that can be because you have an underlying mental illness, that can be a trigger. Number one, in limited cases, like this is a much smaller percentage of people. The vast majority of people don't end up in that situation, but it never has to go there for most people.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, we play it to what I'm seeing in today's world is we're growing to be more risk averse. So we're like, let's make sure that we don't cause any harm. So there's a one-off scenario where somebody has, not one-off, but there's times when somebody might have some grief and an underlying mental health issue. And if not treated appropriately, that person is in grave danger. So then we say that 1 out of 99, if that's the case, and that's not a real stat, I'm just saying, for example, 1 out of 99 have that problem. And then we go, well, we need to treat the whole 100 as if they're the 1%, and make sure that we're kid gloving them and make sure that that one person won't be in danger.
Right.
That's how I'm feeling. So then we make it so that the rest of the 99 can't get help in the more traditional, natural ways. We're playing to the what if.
Yes. Yeah. And so like, I think that like there's this difference between like, I had a bad day. I was feeling bad today, so I overate because I was depressed or I was feeling sad. And legitimately, you're going to cope, and sometimes you're not going to cope in like a wise way when you're feeling grief, which is pain. It feels terrible, right? Which is very different from that becoming problematic, right? And like falling down that hole of like, then I'm going to do it tomorrow, and this is how I'm going to cope the next day, and this is how I'm going to cope the next day. If you're just somebody who, has that experience and you're in an understanding community and they're like, yeah, I've been there too. You can recognize that for what it is and not continue down that spiral of addiction, as opposed to somebody who is isolated and this is their only way to cope. And you can see how that could spiral into something that I do every day. And this is how I cope with my grief. I eat my feelings, I drink my feelings, I smoke my feelings or whatever. And that's how those kind of things can spiral for somebody that really at the end of the day, they were sad, they had a bad day, they have a community around them. Yeah, I've been there as well. And tomorrow we're going to cope in a different way. And I'm going to be here and we're going to walk this path together. For me, that's been extremely healing for me. And I think for, the majority of people, that's how we deal with this. And so why not come up with like a larger picture strategy for that? Because the services exist already. There are good people doing this every day, whether they are staff of organizations, boards, or volunteers. People are doing this throughout the province every day. So why not just look at the big picture of this and make this maybe part of the healthcare system generally, because we do have to start thinking about, the healthcare system as opposed to the medical care system.
We'll talk more about that right after this, but fascinating what you're talking about, and how counterintuitive it is to say, there's this feeling of need for isolation and privacy because I don't want to be vulnerable, but the answer is a group of people that can actually connect with you. And that's kind of how the 12-step world works, and that separation. So it's fascinating, and there's evidence to show that it works. But we'll be right back after this break with Bronagh Morgan. Welcome back to Stirring Strength, and we're having a great conversation with Bronagh Morgan. Bronagh, we were talking before about the value of connection, and I can see how there's a big segregation in the thinking and the need, and how we disconnect from that. I was hoping to spend the second segment talking a little bit more about this bigger idea of peer support and integrating it into the community, and I would like for you to kind of share some of the what the barriers have been, or what barriers you met 5 years ago, and what you're planning on seeing the barriers now to make something like this come to life.
Well, I think going back to what we talked about before, people just not wanting to talk about death, right? And so it's not sexy, or it's not people's hot button issue most of the time, right? There's so many, obviously, things that are on people's minds, right? The economy, what's happening in different countries right now, like our relationships with the United States, and jobs and tariffs, and then taking these issues, locally, looking at, how many people are living unhoused, and the cost of, renting a house, and are kids ever going to be able to get there, or young people ever going to be able to get there? So there are so many things that the media is talking about, people are talking about all the time. These are like the election issues that you're always going to hear the politicians talking about prevention. Like it's all of the things that I'm talking about are kind of like prevention. It's hard to articulate prevention, right? And so to be able to kind of tie some of the issues that are really on people's minds to, well, where did this start? Because like, it's kind of like always saying, we're going to add more hospital beds. You can add hospital beds all day long, but unless you get back to like the source, which is giving people the tools that they need to live healthier lives, you're going to have to keep feeding into that end system. That's not to say we don't need better, we need more places for people to live that are unhoused. We need to lower rents. But at the same time, we're going to keep that pipeline, and it's going to keep on widening at the end unless we start stemming the tide at the source.
Right.
And that's prevention. Prevention is always the hardest thing to articulate, but I think the difference now between 5 years ago is we have statistics. Like there have been people that have been doing some great studies over the last 5 years talking about, well, where does homelessness start? And in the vast majority of cases there as well, it is precipitated by some kind of loss. Whether that's loss of, a family member, the person that you live with, or the person that's your financial support, or loss of your job, or loss of something else that is vital for you to be able to function in society and be able to pay your rent, right? So we have those statistics now. It's just a matter of people having the passion and being able to, draw that straight line and hold their politicians' feet to the fire. You can keep on selling me on, I'm going to do the X number more beds. I'm going to throw this amount of money at the end users, but we have to, we're never going to get anywhere. I was in politics more than 25 years ago, and we started an Ontario health tax, and that was supposed to solve all the problems with healthcare in 2003. And where did that get us? We still have to keep on feeding more money into a system which is actually not improving.
Taxes don't
unless we start grappling with the source, and unless we start dealing with the source and dealing with prevention. And whether that is this, this grief support idea that I'm talking about, or other things like, prioritizing, nutritious food being cheaper for people to buy as opposed to junk food being cheaper, right? These kind of things, they're all policy related. They're all things that we could be doing, but we're always just dealing with the end result, right?
The saying is, stop pulling people out of the river and figure out why they're falling in the first place.
Thank you. That's a lovely metaphor.
Right. So, and I see it every day and recognize that it's, and I don't want to get into a overly political conversation, because it's so easy.
I know.
It's so easy to get into, but I also recognize that there's not a lot of people casting votes on politicians that are voting for prevention because they want the problem solved of what's going on in the core, or what's wrong with this, or how are we saving lives, what are we doing about these big hot button issues. And the hot button issues tend to be the ones that have the biggest voice, right? Because people are concerned about the well-being or housing of individuals, right? But we need to change this to say, how can we get some of this over here and prevent them from getting there in the first place?
You know what the magic is, though, Dean? When we talk about things like peer support, that's astronomically cheaper than medical health care. Astronomically cheaper. The things that organizations that work in this area right now do with very small budgets, with wonderful, dedicated teams of volunteers are amazing. So this is actually a huge cost savings. People just have to realize the $10,000 that you spend in mental health care, which is probably not even that, that's not that much care, that could be helping 100 times more people to not end up there if we invest that money in prevention.
Right. So we have to, I know that we're limited on time, and so I want to get to, so the idea is having peer support individuals helping in the community. How is that regulated? How do we recognize, because I know in the regular 12-step world, sometimes there's concern with dysregulation or a danger or people that shouldn't be doing the work, and and there's these concerns, right? So those need to be kind of buttoned up in order for this to come true. So what does that look like?
Absolutely. And so that's why I talk about the organizations that are already doing this work. So this is not a new idea. I didn't come up with this idea. The only thing I guess that is unique about me is that because I have this politics background, I think that this needs to be dealt with on a kind of a more wide, big picture scale, because there are organizations like bereaved families, like Pregnancy and Infant Loss Network, like VON, like the hospital, like all different, there are churches that do this. You don't just get to walk in and be a peer supporter. People have very comprehensive training programs. We don't just for bereaved families, for example, you have to have a certain temporal distance from your loss. And then there's a very comprehensive training program that you go through before you get to that stage that you're a peer supporter. And I know we talked a little bit before about how that the 12-step programs work, right? But in these, what I envision is the same kind of concept. There are people that really do not like being in, group therapy. I'm just not comfortable with that setting. And so there is one-on-one support for those people with a peer, with an understanding peer who has walked the same road. For people who function, who really appreciate that sense of community, that's available as well. For people who don't want to just sit around doing group therapy, I do healing through art. So while rather than just sitting around the table talking, we're doing art while we're talking, but we know we're in a community of people who understand. And that's how you can get you can have those conversations, but your hands are busy cooking things, whether maybe running groups. Like there's so many different ways that this can be implemented, and it already is being implemented now. But why have all of these organizations fighting for the same donations and so much cost of administration when we could have a provincial strategy that lets all of these people who have been doing the work do that work without worrying about this, without worrying about that administrative piece. That was my goal 5 years ago, and that's my goal now. If I can convince more people to tell your politicians to this matters and this works and this is going to save us a lot of money, and at the end of the day, it's going to benefit every single person because we're all going to end up here.
I certainly see the value in it, and I get it. And just a quick caveat: we're not saying there's anything wrong with the 12-step process, but it's been around for a long time, and it's super impactful. Because I know that talking to somebody that has been through a similar experience to me makes it so much easier for me to just identify and be able to connect in a different way. But back to the whole logistics of it, what is the thing that's preventing this from happening? Why hasn't it happened? We're saying here's this great idea and it makes perfect sense.
I know, and it's interesting too, because like every time I've had a conversation with somebody at the government level, they're like, yeah, it's a good idea. Why don't we just make this happen? All I can put it down to is, when we had this agreement 5 years ago, that was literally March the 10th of 2010. Or 2020, right? So I believe like we started shutting everything down before St. Patrick's Day. So I think like within 2 days, we just put things like this on the back burner, and we really prioritized looking at one thing for 5 years. And I think every time I bring it up again, yes, it's a good idea, but it's just never that one thing that's going to get people reelected, or it's never that one thing that's going to be everybody's hot button issue. Like it's just not on people's radar all the time. And I think a lot of times too, when you're dealing with grieving people, we don't have the energy to kind of push these things forward, because just getting out of bed some days is an accomplishment, right? But with the distance that I have from this and the team behind me that I'm working with, trying to move these issues forward, we'll do that job for you. I have a law background, so if there's legislation that needs to be written, I can write the legislation. We have people who have worked on the front lines with people with mental health, substance abuse issues. So we have the people in place. It's just really the political will to say, let's just do this kind of province-wide, as opposed to just in silos, the way we do right now. And then nobody would ever experience a loss and not know where they could go without a supportive peer, somebody who understands. That will, it seems like a no-brainer to me.
You're dead on the money, and then there's a limitless supply of peers available, because we already said it happens to everybody. Absolutely. Right? So I appreciate you being on the show today, and I appreciate your advocacy and the stuff you're doing, and hope to keep in touch with how things move forward.
Thanks so much,
Bronagh. Thank you for watching Stirring Strength, and we'll see you next time.